A group of former national security leaders has warned that Australia is deeply underprepared to deal with the existential risks posed by climate change. They're pressing the government to make much more rapid cuts to carbon emissions, ramp up assistance to countries in the region to help them deal with climate threats, and set up a new climate intelligence branch to help plan for disasters. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts joins us now from Parliament House. So Stephen, who's in this group, and can you take us through what they want?
Yeah, this group is a collection of senior security leaders who have now all retired, but who share common anxieties or really deep concerns about just how profound a threat climate change poses to Australia's national security, and who believe that the government simply isn't doing nearly enough to plan adequately for some of the shocks which are already coming our way and which are likely to intensify over time. Now, for example, Chris Barry, the former Chief of the Defence Force, is part of this group. So these are people who have held fairly senior positions in the Australian hierarchy. What do they want? Well, they really want an overhaul of the way that Australia plans for climate change disasters. They say the government and the bureaucracy hasn't yet really grappled with the scale of the challenges which are coming our way. For example, they point out that if you look at the science, there's a decent chance, depending on what happens with emissions, that large swathes of northern Australia could become effectively unlivable within a few decades because of the extremes of heat that people there will have to endure. They also say that we're likely to see mass displacement of people from particularly perhaps Southeast Asia and South Asia as rising sea levels and other shocks really force people out of their homes to look for safer harbours. Now, their argument is that the government does need to do much more, not only increase the amount of assistance it's giving to the region to help deal with climate disasters. Also, they say Australia needs to deal up a new intelligence unit within the Australian government, within the Office of National Intelligence, to try and better assess exactly what threats are coming and how they can be dealt with, as well as, of course, making more rapid cuts to emissions to ensure that Australia is doing its bit to avert a global calamity. Now, let's take a listen to John Blackburn. He's a member of this group, a former second-in-command of the Royal Australian Air Force, speaking about some of the problems that we're already seeing, including in the US in the wake of Hurricane Helene, and what the government should be doing in response.
If you stand up and say to the Australian people, here's a set of risks, then rightly the Australian people say, well, what are you going to do about them? So there is a reluctance there to say what the scale of the problem is. We know the government's worried about the economic impacts. We can see what's happening in the US. They're worried about the impacts on insurance. There will be people in areas in Australia in the future that won't get insurance, and that's a significant problem, not just for them, but for the mortgage market. What they won't talk about gets more interesting. There will be areas, science tells us in the future, where we won't be able to live. Yes, it might be decades away, but we've got to plan for that. And also the scale of what this could look like. Talking about 2 or 3 degrees doesn't mean much to most Australians. Talking about what it was like for people experiencing Hurricane Helene, remembering what we experienced in the bushfires in 2019-20, well, we've forgotten about that. We've got to tell people what it's going to feel like for them and their children, to make them understand why we've got to invest in preparing.
Stephen, the government has conducted a climate change risk assessment, but it hasn't been publicly released. Why is that?
Well, the government says it's an intelligence product and it's not typical for intelligence products to be released to the public. Now, that's true, but the climate leaders that we've spoken to today say that there's simply no good reason why a declassified or an unclassified version of this couldn't be released. And they say not only do the intelligence agencies need to make their own assessments, but they also need to speak to people on the ground, people who've already been impacted by climate change, people whose homes may be rendered uninhabitable in the future, people who may struggle to get insurance as premiums skyrocket, in order to really grapple with the full scale of this problem. And they say at the moment there simply isn't enough evidence that the government is fully seized of the scale of the challenge that's coming.
Stephen, thank you.